Hi, everyone. Welcome back to this amazing session. I'm very excited that we have Christy Hill with us from PGIM. Welcome, Christy.
Hi there.
We're so happy that you're here. And thank you for taking the time, despite your very busy life. I guess everybody has busy pandemic lives in one way or another. But yeah, thanks for being with us. So I just thought it would be nice to start with a little bit of your story. In particular, I think it's pretty fascinating that you started at PGIM as the head of U.S. asset management, right? Yeah, and then you became this ESG person. So how did that happen? And do you think that's been a good way to do it for PGIM? Can you tell us about that?
No, I think that's a great question, and I think the perfect place to start for this conversation. And the reality is, when I came into PGIM, I came in with a couple of decades of experience in sustainability, both from the asset level and from the portfolio level. So when I joined, I think it was a natural fit, and we saw the opportunity to really kind of leverage my experience to help inform and develop the program and come up with a point of view on where we wanted it to go. But I think sort of beyond me, the real drive and the real logic and rationale for why I stepped into that role was really because of the importance that asset management plays in the ESG space. And when you think of the asset life cycle and the group that's sort of most embedded at the grassroots level from cradle to grave, that's really the asset management team. And clearly the assets are evolving every day, but as we know, the ESG world is evolving every day. So it made a lot of sense, or we thought it made a lot of sense, to put the team that has the front row seat to the evolution of both of those, progressions, the asset and ESG side by side, so that we could be focused on continually improving the position and performance of the assets. And then third, I always say that asset management is really the intersection of strategy and execution. And as we all know, a lot of the water in ESG really gets carried at that asset level. So we also thought that by housing ESG within the asset management function, it gave the team that was most focused on it, they were also the team that has the greatest ability to actually influence and effectuate change at the asset level. So between the visibility across ESG and the asset, plus the ability to be impactful, it really felt like asset management was the right place to house it. Now, I think the other part of your question is, how do we do it? And I think that is something that could take a whole session in and of itself, because there's clearly a lot to do there. But the way we address it at PGIM Real Estate is I work very closely with our Director of Sustainability and our portfolio teams around the globe to really set strategy and objectives. And then from there, we leverage a pretty robust network of councils and liaisons to help spread the word, spread best practices, spread the initiatives, and make sure we're tracking all of those as well as we possibly can, to make sure we're getting sort of the impact that we want to have across the globe.
Yeah, that's great. That's very helpful. And I like the model a lot in asset management. I like to talk about stewardship of buildings as sort of part of what the work is with ESG stuff. And the stewards of buildings oftentimes are people in asset management, right? They're the ones that really kind of see their role that way, in the industry. So I love it. I love that that's where it sits. It makes sense. So part of your role, I understand, is to field questions from investors that relate to ESG. And I would really love to hear what you're seeing. I mean, you could talk about, the general stuff that you get, but more so, how is that changing? How are the questions changing over time?
Yeah, that is, it's such a fascinating question for me to answer, because it's evolved so much over the course of my career. And I can really think back to 20 years ago when I was making the case and convincing people to retrofit lighting and install drought-resistant landscaping. And thankfully, I think the globe has largely wrapped its head around the concept and the value of sustainability. But now we've progressed, and now the investor base is really focused so much more holistically on ESG, all together, not just the sustainability component. And I'm going to quote a couple surveys, because I think they actually evidence this better than I do. So I may look at my notes to get the numbers right. But there was a survey conducted of U.S. investors with AUM of more than 50 billion. And this survey is a couple of years old, but still very telling. And in 2018, the number of US investors who said ESG influences their investment process was 61%. For context, just 3 years before, that number was 31%. So from 31 to 61 in the US in 3 years. And that was 3 years ago, and it feels like it's doubled since then. I mean, just the flow of questions, it's kind of, it's really impressive. And I use that word because it's amazing to see how deep our investor base is really getting in this space. But we also know that the US investor base is lagging on this front, and that it's really the European investor base that's kind of groundbreaking. And Mercer actually just conducted their European asset allocation survey for 2020, and those results were just published. And this one I am going to read to make sure I get it right, because that survey basically found that 89% of respondents said they consider ESG risks. This was up from 55% the prior year, and more than double 40% of the prior year. So in the US, 31 to 62 in 3 years. In Europe, it went from 40 to 89 in 3 years. And then specifically, as part of that Mercer survey, they focused on climate change. And they found that 54% of their investors were specifically focused on climate change. So clearly we're seeing just robust, intense interest. But as you alluded to when you asked the question, it's not just the number of questions and checking boxes anymore. You know, going back 5 years ago, 7 years ago, the questions were typically around, do you have a policy? What does your policy say? Where now our investor base is deeply, meaningful and knowledgeable, and they're asking about strategies. They're asking about protocols. They're asking about data collection. They're asking about fractions of GRES points in some instances and how we compare. So it has indeed gotten much broader, but also much deeper at the same time.
It's so cool to hear. It's also kind of amazing to me to know that that people care about that level of detail, right? But they do, and I think it's a great sign, because we've always known that having a report isn't really a way of understanding good sustainability, but it's just taken a while to build up that measurability of all of these different factors that contribute, right, to a genuine way of saying we have an environmental record, and we want to know what it is. That totally makes sense, and it's really great to hear. And so you mentioned climate change, and I want to talk a little bit about one aspect of that, because we both are here in California and have been experiencing all of the wildfires and things. And it's just been in the news, all of these things about risk and insurance and such. So I would love to hear how you all are thinking about that at PGIM. How do you think about climate risk and resiliency for your portfolio? And is it something that you think about more these days?
Well, 2020 is the year that keeps on giving, for sure. And I hope you guys are doing okay up north. I know I'm about an hour and a half away from 140,000 acres that are on fire right now. And I got woken up last week by an earthquake. So if it's not one thing, it is another.
It is.
And I think that's why it's really important that we talk about it, not only as individuals, but as organizations with large platforms. We are in a position to effectuate change. And so I thank you, and I probably should have said that at the start. I thank you for having me here, because I do think this is a great platform to talk about this. And, we think about it constantly. I mean, and that sounds dramatic, but this is something that is so embedded in our DNA for PGIM Real Estate. And we are working really closely right now with our consultant to develop a really robust global resiliency program. And that sounds a little bit dramatic. And I try to break everything down and make it digestible, because I think that's when you can actually start to see results. And resiliency for us really means assess, plan, implement. I mean, really at its most foundational level, that's what we're trying to do. And that's what our global resiliency program really focuses on. Now, the devil's in the details, and there's a lot of complexity in there, but ultimately It is assess, plan, implement. So for us, that means when we're about to buy an asset, we need to understand all the risks that are going to potentially face that asset, whether they be physical, social, climate risk, transitional risk. It's about understanding everything that could pose a threat so that then we can understand how that threat's going to impact the asset, either physically or economically from a performance perspective, because all of this is very critically important, but performing for our investors by delivering returns is also critically important to us. So it's about understanding how these risks, where these risks exist and how they're going to impact our property or how they could potentially impact the property. That then leads us into the strategic aspect of planning for it. And this is how we think about every asset. Now we know what those risks are. How can we start to think about what we need to do to mitigate those risks? So whether we're talking about operational strategies, about clearing brush or changing your landscaping to something that's drought tolerant to reduce your water consumption, whether you're talking about something that's capital in nature, like installing a floodgate, installing solar panels, we may be thinking about that, or whether it is social and stakeholder, focus, where we are doing evacuation drilling and disaster preparedness with our residents and our tenants. We're thinking about all of those things, and it really is important that contemplates that climate risk assessment up front and understanding is the threat wind, is the threat heat, is the threat water, so that we can really come up with a way to figure out, okay, we know what the threat is, how can we position our property to be resilient on an ongoing basis, and how can we position it so candidly we can also get the best pricing from an insurance perspective, because that actually ties in on the governance piece. And that's the least exciting part of ESG to talk about, is the governance piece, but it's a critical component of it, and all of this also factors in to risk management.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is it's not just a matter of finding out that a property is, near the ocean and you sell it. It's much more complicated than that, right? Yeah.
It's thankfully so, because I don't think any of us really want to abandon our coastal investment strategies. I mean, these are good strategies, and a lot of our best real estate is along the coast, and that is where people want to live and work. And so it's really incumbent on us to figure out a way to allow them to do that safely. Yeah.
What a challenge, isn't it? It's a fascinating time in that way. Like, just to think about what our jobs are in that sense. Like, these, the coasts are going to get hit more, and they're going to that's all going to increase. And our job is to create that space for people to continue to live and thrive. And yeah, it's a good profession to be in. Well, okay,
well,
so
we're both in California, and we're not trying to figure out ways to leave California. We're trying to figure out ways to live here.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's it. Well, and I think to some degree it's because we're all recognizing that these are our homes. This is where we want to be. We're not giving up on it, But okay, I have a very nerdy question to follow up on that. So I know we were getting lovely and big picture there. Can you tell us a little bit more about the assessment of climate risk and the platform kind of question? A lot of real estate companies are looking at ways to gather climate risk data through using different platforms and things. How have you guys approached that?
So not dissimilar to anything in the world. As soon as something gains visibility or popularity, all of a sudden there are 1,000 vendors trying to provide that service. And we've certainly seen that hit in the climate risk assessment space as well. So for us, looking at this across a substantial portfolio globally, we really wanted to make sure we were working with the right group. And so we actually did a deep dive into about 8 different groups to figure out what was best for us, what was the best fit for PGIM. And that's not to say that what's best for us is best for everybody, but there were kind of a handful of things that we were really focused on. And first and foremost was credibility from the scientific community. I mean, ultimately, the scientific community is leading us in this battle. They've got the right answers, and we wanted to really look to a platform that we thought was following that lead. And part of that is making sure that our assessments had credibility. But part of it was also to make sure that we were assessing the same metrics that the scientific community is telling us are important, but also assessing the same metrics that the real estate community is telling us are important. So that was kind of the first big pieces that the first big things we focused on. Somebody that could provide it for us globally was really important because, again, we didn't want to be piecing this together from a bunch of different places. And somebody that had a really strong data and technology platform, again, really critical to us. I happen to personally be in the mindset of he with the most data will win, or she with the most data will win in the long run. And when you think about all of the things that we are collecting at the asset level around the globe at every property, there's just a tremendous amount of data. So what we were very mindful of is not jumping in with a group who, if 5 years from now we wanted to look back and try to aggregate or leverage that data, didn't have the technology platform to allow us to do that. So that was a big one. And then scalable, easy to use, and good pricing. I mean, just like everything, it's like ultimately, and not that that's the deciding factor, but when you want to roll something out across a large platform, you want to make sure everybody knows how to use it. You want to make sure you're getting the best pricing for it. So we ended up with 427. We're working with 427. It was a great partnership with Measurable. But just like everything else in the space, we're going to keep looking at it every day, day in and day out, to make sure it's evolving to meet the needs the way we needed it.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, thank you. That's good to hear, and a nice shout out for Measurable there. I love and know, and I hadn't known about 427 before, but I found out from you talking about them that they're based in Berkeley, and I always get excited about, well, I should say go Bears, but that just the community here in the East Bay. Do you have a different team you want to root for?
I was going to say, when you said go Bears, I feel like I need to say fight on, but that's probably beyond the crowd that may be watching.
It's all right. We're allowed to bring our allegiances here, I think. But no, thank you. That's really helpful. I know as a former software provider, it's one of those things that people really need to be hearing, and it's just helpful to have someone like you who's had the chance to look at a lot of vendors and to think about what you need. And it's also really great to hear, I think, and I hope everyone takes note of this, just how methodical you are in thinking about your providers that you work with. I love the point that you want to be able to focus on these bigger data sets, to have that longevity so that the data can grow over time and be something really powerful. I think that's super critical. And I'm not sure it's always a metric or a factor that people consider in these kinds of tools. So I love that, and I'm excited. And it is really amazing to know that people are really getting into that business. This is like a thing all the real estate companies are doing now. So that's great. Okay, well, so a little bit of a different, maybe bigger question. I'd like to know a little bit about your challenges, your biggest challenges as a global portfolio operator when it comes to ESG work. And I think in particular, I know you have some thoughts about just how different it is in different regions that I feel like a lot of people would appreciate hearing. But in particular, just how does that balance out when you're thinking about ESG at a global scale in the work that you do locally?
No, it's fascinating. It's been so fun to jump into this globally, because that was a big change for me personally. I came in with domestic exposure and a lot of experience, but hadn't taken that abroad. And I think with scale comes tremendous opportunity and also tremendous challenge. So we're clearly a fairly large global platform, very large global platform, and so I think one of the challenges is if you're a new fund with 3 buildings, it's very easy to move the needle, and it's very easy to position that fund. If you've got a $70 or $90 billion portfolio or a $25 billion fund, moving that needle, and with legacy assets in there of 10, 20, 30 years, moving that needle becomes very, very challenging. It's just, turning a barge versus turning a jet ski is a very different thing. And so I think just operationally for us, that's a challenge of scale, but also an opportunity, because in this space, the bigger you are, the more impact you can make. And that's what we're trying to achieve. But I think your point is, sort of in the question, you almost hit on the answer, because I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is really just understanding the evolving regulatory environments around the globe. I mean, every government behaves differently. You've got science leading the way, and you've got some countries that want to listen to that and others that don't. So there are some regulatory environments that push our strategy and advance it, and there are others that maybe pose some challenges. In the US, we've got states that operate differently. So it's almost, like we have 50 different countries within the US between codes and some energy regulations. So just staying on top of everything that's happening locally is a challenge in and of itself. And when I say that, it's all of these different global markets presents a real challenge. But this question actually makes me laugh a little bit, because what I love about real estate, what I love about ESG is there's never a day that you don't learn something new. Like there's never 2 days that are the same. And I actually learned of a different tactical challenge just a couple of weeks ago. We talk about all of this data collection, and we want to be able to use our electricity consumption as an example, a metric. Electricity consumption in the US is billed in arrears based on an actual reading, where there are other global regions where it's billed in advance on a projection and then trued up at the end of the year. So if you're actually trying to monitor your global consumption, you have to normalize the way you're digesting a lot of data, which in some cases just simply isn't possible. I mean, they're not going to change the way our utility companies act. So I think we're finding there are tremendous opportunities which are exciting, but there's also just challenges in bringing together and creating a standard language. I mean, it's almost like saying we want to speak one language around the world. There are inherently going to be some issues when that's what your goal is.
Yeah, it reminds me of the webinar that I did with Brendan Wallace in preparing for this conference, and we were just talking about how, in some ways, what we're trying to do with real estate and sustainability is simple. It's simple to talk about the goals that we're trying to get to, in the world, and whether it's degrees of warming or the reduction of energy consumption. But no one ever said this stuff was easy to work on. It's really quite an interesting challenge of data of different countries. I think your point about regulations is really great. It's part of what I am increasingly trying to pay attention to and help the real estate industry understand, is getting ahead of figuring out what regulations are about to hit so that you can be well positioned for that. And it is a challenge. It's a huge challenge, and one, I think we're all still figuring out how the regulations are even going to work, in some places. So there's that. It's moving all the time. Right?
By the time you figure them out, they could change. I mean, That really is the environment. I mean, there are political drivers, there's changes in the science. So, it is in a little bit of a ways like you're chasing a moving target. But again, I think, to me, I love a good puzzle. And to me, this is such a combination of a strategic puzzle and tactical puzzle, because you can, again, envision everything. But unless you can figure out a way to make that work on the ground, it's just a story that never really comes to a conclusion. So it's really about, to me, when I think about our platform and what I'm trying to get to every day, it's instilling that discipline to stay focused on it every day. And making sure you've got the strategy in the back of your mind, but the discipline looking forward. And you've got to do it every day. And we're going to be doing it every day for the rest of our lives. And so we might as well create that muscle memory.
Yeah. I love that. Okay, well, one last nerdy question, and then I'll ask you something more bigger picture before we end. But it's about building types. You have a big enough portfolio that you have a lot of different building types. Is there anything you can say about just the balance of ESG management across these building types? Which ones are easier, which ones are harder, I guess is one way of putting it. But anything you've learned from managing that complexity?
It's interesting when you said some are easier or harder, because it made me think of it in a bunch of different ways. We know that largely our office buildings are our largest consumers of energy. So we can take a very data-driven approach to that, and we tend to have more operational control of our office buildings. So that helps. That allows us to effectuate change, to implement programs, and to actually kind of get to the bottom line in the office space a lot quicker. That said, we've got a lot more to do in the office space. So while it's easier for us to do it, there's a lot more to do. Now, if you juxtapose the industrial space with that, there we have typically we have significantly less operational control. You've got one tenant that comes into a building. In a lot of cases, they occupy all of it. All the utilities are directly in their name. They largely control the building on their own. So we don't have the ability to go in and set the tone or set benchmarks to try to achieve the way we do in a building that we run. Thankfully, like in states like California, there has been legislation passed that requires those users to share some of that information. So at least we can get visibility into how some of those users are controlling the space. But I would say the challenges in industrial is just a lack of operational control. And then on the multifamily side, ESG broadly, we've got so much more engagement there with our tenants, and I feel like the social elements of ESG are even more critical, and we have a lot of ability to control that environment there. But again, in terms of the way people recycle, the way people use their own water, their own utilities, that's in their hands. So if we're trying to differentiate among asset types, I would say the places where we have the greatest potential are in the sectors and the product types where we have the greatest operational control. I think that'll continue to be the case, but I do think as this becomes more critical as sort of a global mindset or a sort of a global objective, we're seeing large tenants become a little bit more flexible because they're sharing the same goals of wanting to achieve some of these sustainability objectives.
Yeah, and that's the ideal, right? Is hopefully that if we're all working on the same goals in one way or another, then the question of exactly whose responsibility it is, I hope, will be a little bit less critical than, we've run into a lot of these issues with split incentives and things in the past 20 years. But I think you're absolutely right. The larger tenants, just more people in general are getting into the same into the same fight, in one way or another. So I think that's great. Okay, well, one last question. What keeps you up at night about the work?
So I kind of laugh thinking about this one because what keeps me up at night is wishing I had paid more attention in my science classes, or at least paid as much attention in there as I did in my finance and real estate classes, because so many of the conversations I'm having now, I've been a lifelong pure play real estate person, and whether it's learning about coronavirus or learning about sustainability, I'm taking on more of a sciencey role than I ever anticipated, and I'm trying to rise to the occasion, but it's a challenge. But in all seriousness, I look at our platform and I look at the size of our platform, and with over 1,500 properties, we've got over 1.5 million tenants and residents. I view what we are doing in this space not as a responsibility, but really an obligation. When you have the ability to move the needle, I think that is an obligation, and we can all turn the water off when we brush our teeth, and that's a great thing for us to do as individuals. But when I look at a portfolio of our size, I go, okay, this is important because we can make a difference in the world. And so I think what keeps me up is just making sure we're doing it well enough, making sure we're keeping up. We've been talking, like 3 different questions have come back to a changing science and changing regulatory environments. And so for me, it's just wanting to stay on the forefront of this. And we're not trying to check a box. This is really meaningfully in our DNA. We want to make a difference. And the last thing I want to do is be, the last one to the party on something. I want PGIM Real Estate to be leading the way in ESG. This is important to us. It's important to our investors. It's important to our employees and our tenants and our residents. And so I think what worries me the most is just staying on top of everything and staying current with all of the science that makes me want to pull my hair out.
I can definitely relate to that. It's a challenge these days to keep up with everything, and the world is changing so fast. So I can appreciate that. But I think it's testament to your leadership that's what you worry about, is just staying up to date and wanting to be responsive and wanting to lead. So thank you for that. Thank you for your leadership. Thanks for chatting today. It's been a pleasure. And that wraps up our session. So thanks everybody for joining. We'll see you soon.